So as we've been going through the summer together, we've been talking about Come to the Water. We've been talking about stories that happen near or on or in the water. Or we've been thinking about the symbolism of water and the life that it brings. And this morning I want us to think together about healing waters. Healing waters. There are a number of stories in Scripture in which water is involved in healing. And we're only going to look at a few of them this morning. But what I'd like to do is kind of different. We're going to start in 2 Kings. That's in the Old Testament. If you open the Bible right in the middle, you'll turn left. Find 2 Kings chapter 5. We're going to start there. But this morning, I'd like for us to think together about 3 stories, and then we're going to make 3 observations. We're going to look at 3 different stories, and then we'll make 3 observations about those stories. All right? Our first story is in 2 Kings chapter 5. We're going to begin at verse 1. Naaman, commander of the army of the king of Syria, was a great man with his master and in high favor, because by him the Lord had given victory to Syria. He was a mighty man of valor, but he was a leper. So notice in that first verse, Naaman is a somebody. He was the commander of the army. He answered only to the king of Syria. And all of the military was under his power, under his control. He was a mighty man of valor, the verse says. He was a powerful man, but he had leprosy. Now, that word leprosy was used for a number of different skin diseases. Today, we would separate those into different kinds of skin diseases, but for them, they kind of lumped all the different skin problems into this one word. But they had no treatment. And so quite often, leprosy described that disease, which led to basically decay, that the body would just start to die through the skin. It was a horrible disease. It was terrible to watch. It was very painful. It was very contagious, and so this was a terrible thing for this great man of valor to have to go through. So, long story short, there's a servant girl working in Naaman's household. This servant girl was from Israel. And she said, back home, we got this dude who's a prophet, and he talks to God, and I'll bet he could heal you. So Naaman goes to his king and says, hey, would you write a letter to the king over there in Israel? Tell him who I am, and that way I can go over there, and maybe I can get healed. Well, I don't know if his king misunderstood, or if the king in Israel didn't read their letter right, or just what it was. But by the time the letter gets to the king in Israel thinks that he's supposed to heal Naaman. He reads this letter. Naaman is this great guy. He's awesome. He's wonderful. We were frat bros back in college. He's cool, yeah. But he's got leprosy. Can you heal him? Well, the king freaks out. No, I can't heal him. What am I, a god? I don't have any way to heal this guy. What am I going to do? And now he realizes that because he can't complete this task, because he can't fulfill this request, the king in Syria is going to get ticked off at him. And the fact that he can't heal this Naaman character, it's going to lead to conflict, maybe even war. And so the king just tears his clothes in grief and agony. What am I going to do? And we pick up the story at verse 8. But when Elisha, the man of God, that in this context, that phrase man of God means he is the prophet. When Elisha, the man of God, heard that the king of Israel had torn his clothes, he went to the king, saying, "Why have you torn your clothes? Let him come now to me, that he may know that there is a prophet in Israel." So Naaman came with his horses and chariots and stood at the door of Elisha's house. And Elisha sent a messenger to him. Now stop right there. Did you already hear a potential conflict? Naaman, it said in verse 9, he came with his horses and his chariots. He had a whole entourage. He is a somebody. And he wants everybody who sees him down the road to know that he's a somebody. And so he comes to the place of the prophet and his whole entourage. I don't know how much of the army. He's got all these people. Here's a somebody who's come to see the prophet. And then what did Elisha do in verse 10? Elisha sent a messenger to him. Elisha says, "Man, I'm laid up in my easy chair. I'm watching my stories. I ain't got time for you." He sends a messenger out. That was by design. God knew and therefore worked through Elisha that Naaman had a pride problem. And so Naaman shows up with this great entourage, and Elisha says, "You're not even worth my time. I'll send a messenger to tell you what you need to know." Well, you can imagine that doesn't sit very well with Naaman. We'll pick it up again in verse 10. Elisha sent a messenger to him, saying, "Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored, and you shall be clean." But Naaman was angry and went away, saying, "Behold, I thought that he would surely come out to me and stand and call upon the name of the Lord his God and wave his hand over the place and cure the leper. Are not Abana and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than all the waters in Israel? Could I not wash in them and be clean?" So he turned and went his way in rage. He got upset. I thought if at least Elisha would come out and heal me like they said. He sent a messenger, and the messenger told me to go take a bath in that nasty water in Jordan. I'm not going to do that. Who do they think they are? And he turned his back and walked away. Now understand, in order for Naaman to make his point, he walks away from his healing. He wants everybody to know that he doesn't like what God said, so to prove that he's mad, he walks away from the very thing he needs the most. And beloved, we see people every day do exactly the same thing. They don't like submitting to God, doing things God's way, and so to make their point, they act like they're going to hurt him by walking away. And when they do, they leave the very things they need the most. Naaman was proud. He said, "I just knew you'd come out, that Elisha would come out and wave his hand and I'd be healed. Instead, he's going to tell me to go to the river? No, I don't do things his way. I'm a somebody." And he and his leprosy turned around and walked off. Verse 13. But his servants came near and said to him, "My father, it is a great word the prophet has spoken to you. Will you not do it? Has he actually said to you, 'Wash and be clean'?" They said, "Look, dude, it's easy. This is a great word. All he said you had to do was get wet. Are you really not willing to do that simple thing? It's not like he asked you to run a battle or to wage war or to beat an enemy. It's simple. Trust and obey. It's really pretty simple. Matter of fact, I would suggest to you that had Elisha told him some big, huge, massive, impossible thing to do, Naaman would have done it. Because that would speak to his pride, and in his pride he would have said, "You watch me do it." But when Elisha gave him something simple to do, almost demeaning, he said, "I'm not doing that." And the servant says, "Look, this is so simple. Would you just go and give it a whirl? Just try it." Verse 14, so he went down, dipped himself 7 times in the Jordan, according to the word of the man of God, and his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. Then he returned to the man of God, he and all his company, and he came and stood before him, and he said, "Behold, I know that there is no God in all the earth but in Israel. So accept now a present from your servant." Whole different change. See, I think God not only healed his body, but he healed his spirit as well. And now this is a new man. This is a man who says, God is the real deal. And as of today, I'm going to serve him. Think about Naaman for just a minute and we can understand D.L. Moody's summary. D.L. Moody said talking about Naaman, he lost his temper, then he lost his pride, then he lost his leprosy. This is generally the order in which proud, rebellious sinners are converted. They lose their temper, then they lose their pride, then they lose the disease, the sin. So that's an awesome story. The story is Naaman had leprosy, go dip into the river Jordan 7 times, and he's healed. Look with me at another story about healing waters. We're going to jump now to John. Go to the New Testament, the 4th book of the New Testament. We're in the Gospel of John. Look with me in chapter 9. In John chapter 9, I want us to look at this story in verse 1. As he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth, and his disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Jesus answered, "It was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I'm in the world, I am the light of the world." They said, "Jesus, how come this guy's blind? Did he sin or his parents sin? Because he was born that way. So it must maybe his parents." And Jesus said, "Guys, every time something bad happens, it's not because God's punishing someone. Sometimes that happens, but it's not every time. You can't assume that. In this case, God had a plan for this man's life." And so he says, you got it all wrong. This was done so that God could be glorified. Verse 6 then, having said these things, he spit on the ground, made mud with the saliva. Then he anointed the man's eyes with the mud and said to him, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. So he went and washed and came back seeing. This time, the man is blind. Jesus gets some dirt, spits in it, makes a mud paste, puts the mud paste on his eyes, and says, "Now go wash your face in the pool of Siloam." What a strange thing to say. What a strange thing to do. He makes mud with spit, tells the guy to wash his face. But this time, the guy obeyed without hesitation. And when he did, his sight returned. He didn't return, he never had it. Now he finally had sight. Let's look at another story. You're in chapter 9. Turn left to chapter 5. Chapter 5, beginning at verse 1. John 5:1. After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool in Aramaic called Bethesda, which has 5 roofed colonnades. In these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. Now, right here, there is a difference in how our versions read based on the ancient early manuscripts. The earliest manuscripts end verse 3 right there and do not contain what ours show up as verse 4. So those of you who have a version or translation that has another part of verse 3 and a verse 4, yours reads something like, an angel would come into the pool at certain seasons and would stir up the water so that the first person who got in the pool each day would be healed. Well, that's left out of the earliest manuscripts, so some of our translations won't show that. However, I do think that whether that was included in the original manuscript or not, it probably is a historical fact because that makes the story make sense. All right? Now, verse 5. One man who was there, who had been an invalid for 38 years, when Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had already been there a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be healed?" And I thought, when I first read that, what a strange question. Here's an invalid. And Jesus says, "Do you want to be healed?" Why would he ask that question? I think he asked that question because this man had been in this spot for a very long time. The pool is surrounded by the lame and the blind and the invalids and those who cannot take care of themselves. But also over time, some of them have just settled into their spot. As is often the case with folks in need of something from God, we just settle into our spot. And so Jesus says, "Do you want to be healed? Or are you just here because this is where you think you belong? Do you want to be healed?" And the guy responds and says, "Well, yeah, man, I really do. I want to be healed, but I can't." Look at verse 7. The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. And while I am going, another steps down before me. Nobody will put me there, and I can't get there fast enough, and someone always beats me." And Jesus said to him, "Get up, take your bed, and walk." And at once the man was healed. He took up his bed and he walked. 3 stories that have something to do with healing waters. I want us to think together now and make 3 observations about these 3 stories. When we take them together, there are many things we can learn, at least 3. 1, we can depend on God even though He doesn't work the same way with every person. I hope that you'll put that away in your head somewhere, and maybe one of these days you'll be able to meditate on it long enough that it settles into your heart, because you and I need to live with this understanding. We can depend on God even though He doesn't work with the same way with every person. That's important for us to understand because we see how God works in our lives. And then if He's not doing that in someone else's life, it's real easy for us to say, "See, you're wrong. God works this way. If He's not doing this in you, there's something wrong with you." It's real easy for us to get that false perspective. There's also a false perspective that is the opposite of that. So-and-so says, here's my testimony, this is my story, this is the way God works. And we say, but He's never done it that way for me. And now we feel too little, too less. We feel insignificant and unused and unloved. You see, what we need to understand is that we can depend on God, even though He doesn't work the same way with every person. With Naaman, first he sent a messenger out to do the talking. Then he told Naaman, go to the river Jordan and wash 7 times. With the blind man, the blind man was different than Naaman. Naaman was a powerful, arrogant, unwilling leader, commander of the army. The blind man was a man who was in need, he was humble, and he was obedient. He responded and acted immediately according to what Jesus required of him. And in his case, it wasn't go wash 7 times. It was, let me put this stuff on your eye, now go wash your face. Different. Simple. And then Jesus met the lame man, the one who was absolutely desperate, helpless, and dependent on others. And in his case, did you notice Jesus didn't use the water at all? Matter of fact, the man was saying, the water is how we get healed. I got to get in the water. That's the way it works. And Jesus said, no, it works the way I say it works. Get up and walk. One had to go to take a bath 7 times. One had to wash his face. The other one didn't even have to touch the water at all. You see how God works differently with each of us? We can depend on Him even though He works differently. When Paul was explaining to the early church how things work in the church, he was saying God gave each of us different gifts. We each have different abilities. We each have different roles to play. And in that conversation, in 1 Corinthians chapter 12 at verse 6, he said, and there are varieties of activities, but it is the same God who empowers them all in everyone. We're different, but we can all depend on God, even though He works with us in different ways. The second observation that I hope that we can catch this morning is that we can trust God even when we don't understand what He's doing. First, we can depend on God even though He works differently among us. Second, we can trust God even when we don't understand what He's doing. Naaman's response, it did come out of arrogance and pride, but certainly you and I can understand his confusion. He shows up thinking that the man of God is going to heal him, and instead the man of God tells him to go take a bath. And not only take a bath, but take a bath in this specific river and do it 7 times. Naaman didn't understand that. Why that river? Matter of fact, he says, hey, you know my 2 rivers where I live back home, they got better water than the Jordan. We all kind of think that, don't we? Home is always better. My people are better than your people. My place is better than your place, my home. And he thought, I could just go home. I can go swimming in my own river if that's what you're after. He didn't understand. And why 7 times? What a strange thing to say. Wash 7 times? The Bible, by the way, doesn't tell us why. And I think that that is important because the whole point is he had to obey. That's the whole point. While we don't really know why, other than it was a chance for him to obey, there is the possibility that 7 is that number of completion. In Scripture, 7 represents the number of completion or perfection. And so I think it's very likely that Elisha told him 7 times so that he could show that he is completely ready to obey and to submit. But what a weird thing. Go to that river, do it 7 times. We can trust God even when we don't understand what He's doing. He couldn't have understood what God was up to. Then think about that blind dude in the Jesus story. Imagine being that guy. He can't see, he's blind, going about his business. All of a sudden, Jesus walks up, says, "Hey, put this in your eyes." Spits into mud and puts it in his eye. The only thing that would make sense in that thing is that Jesus told him to go wash his face. I bet he was ready to go wash his face. It doesn't make sense. We can trust God even when we don't understand what He's doing. The lame man at the pool of Bethesda, he knew that apparently that angel would come and stir up the water. He knew if he could get there, he'd be healed. He just never could get there, but that's all he knew. That's how God worked. He worked through the water, and yet Jesus came and just healed him. It didn't make sense. Beloved, we can trust God even when we don't understand what He's doing. Isaiah says it so beautifully. Isaiah 55, beginning at verse 8, God says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." Friends, we want to spend the rest of our lives trying to understand God, trying to understand Him and relate to Him. But as we do, we can always rest assured that we'll never get Him figured out. His ways are higher than our ways. His thoughts are higher than our thoughts. Let me tell you, if you could fully understand God, that would make you His equal, and you ain't that. There's one God. You can't put Him in your box and say, "I've got Him figured out." You can neither confine nor define God. You can't limit Him, and you can't fully define Him or understand Him completely. It becomes our joyous task to spend the rest of our lives and into eternity learning of Him. Our God is so big, so awesome. Oh Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You see, He is beyond our understanding, but we can trust Him even when we don't understand what He's doing. And finally, look at this observation. We must obey God even when we don't know why He tells us to do something. How many of you remember growing up, Mom or Dad would say, "Do this or that," and we'd say, "Why?" What was the answer? Why do we obey God? Because He said so. Naaman, why do you have to bathe 7 times? Why not 6? Because He said so. Why are you going to put spit in my eye and tell me to wash my face? Why does it have to be that way? Because He said. We don't have to understand why. But we must obey. It would reverse the roles if God had to answer to us as to His reasons why. That would reverse the roles. That would put you in authority over Him. He's not your servant. It's supposed to be the other way around. We must obey even when we don't know why He tells us to do something. If you ever listen to Christian radio, I'll bet you that you've heard this song. Listen real quick and see if this is familiar.
And not be served. I know. God is on the move, Hallelujah. God
Is that familiar to anybody? God is on the move. Hallelujah. God is on the move. That's an awesome song. It's a really good song. You know who sings that song? It's a group called Seventh Time Down. They chose the name for their band based on this story out of 2 Kings because they realized had Naaman gone down one time into the water, nothing happened. When he went down 2 times, nothing happened. He could have said, look, I'm a somebody. I'm going to try this 3 times, and that's all you're going to get out of me, God. He goes down 3 times, and nothing happens. When did it say he finally got healed? The 7th time down. When he finally set aside his pride, set aside his agenda, and did what God told him to do. This band built their whole name and their whole purpose, reminding us that we must obey God even when we don't know why He tells us to do something. Again, imagine that blind man. All of a sudden, he hears Jesus spit and he's got stuff in his eye. Imagine him following instructions, and yet he did immediately. The lame man asked for one thing, but Jesus did another. We must obey God even when we don't know why He tells us to do something. I learned this in a hard way. Not long after the explosion, I got a call from the mayor. And the mayor said, there's a group that is forming. They're going to form a 501c3, and they're going to be responsible for figuring out how to distribute the designated funds. Would you be willing to be on that board? And I immediately thought, if I do that, it's going to tick some people off, but at least they'll be ticked off at me, and by doing that, I can protect someone else from having to go through it. So I told the mayor, I thought about it, I prayed about it, I told the mayor I would do it. And that experience wound up being one of the top 3 worst experiences of my life. There were a couple of months in there that were absolutely horrible. From that, I learned this. When God tells you to do something, you have to do it. When the mayor calls, hang up immediately. If God calls, you better act. But if other people call, you can hang up. We must obey God even when we don't know why He tells us to do something. When you and I were growing up and Mom or Dad said, because I said so, part of that was to teach us obedience. Part of that, I'm not going to ask you parents and grandparents how many of you have said that line. But those of you who have used that line know part of it is to teach obedience, but part of it is you understand that the child cannot understand all that went into that decision. They're not capable of reasoning through all of the rationale that you used to arrive at that decision. Because they can't reason it out, they don't understand it, they have to trust that you want what's best for them, and they do what you said do because you said so. That is our relationship with the Lord. You and I cannot see what He sees or know what He knows. We can't understand what He understands. Therefore, when He says jump, we act like Simon says, and if God says it, we do it. One of our Sunday school classes likes to sing hymns during the Sunday school hour. I just walked down the hallway a little while ago, and I heard them singing, "Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey. We must obey God even when we don't know why He tells us to do something. 1 Samuel chapter 15. Has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to listen than the fat of rams. In other words, does God like it when you come to church and give an offering and worship Him? You bet. You know what He would like even more? If you obeyed Monday through Saturday. He likes the worship, but to obey is better than the sacrifice. And so Jesus taught His disciples and us in John 14, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments.